Hi everyone. Tonight, we're diving into the long, winding, and quietly fascinating history of France, from its ancient roots to the present day. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and drift through time with me, starting from a world that didn't yet know the word France. Long before there were kings or castles, the land that would one day be France was home to prehistoric peoples who left behind cave paintings deep in the limestone walls of places like Lascaux. These vivid, swirling depictions of bison and deer, etched some 17,000 years ago, remind us that human life flourished here in the shadows of forgotten ages. Over time, these early hunter-gatherers gave way to Neolithic farmers, and then to Bronze Age tribes who constructed megalithic monuments still standing today in Karnak. Thousands of aligned stones, whose meaning we may never fully understand. As centuries passed, Celtic tribes known collectively as the Gauls came to dominate the region. They were fierce, complex people, organized in tribal units with chieftains, druids, warriors, and craftsmen. They traded with the Greeks and Romans, minted coins, and built fortified hill towns called oppida. But their fate would be sealed by the growing shadow of Rome. In 121 BCE, Rome took control of southern Gaul, naming it Provincia Romana, the origin of the name province. But the real transformation came under Julius Caesar, whose Gallic wars between 58 and 50 BC brought the rest of Gaul under Roman rule. The conquest wasn't just a military affair, it was a cultural upheaval. Latin became the language of administration, Roman roads and aqueducts reshaped the landscape, and cities such as Lutetia, the future Paris, began to rise along the Seine. Gaul was now an integral part of the Roman Empire, and for centuries it remained a jewel in the imperial crown. Roman law, architecture, and urban planning took root, merging with Celtic traditions to create a hybrid identity. But nothing lasts forever. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, cracks began to appear in the Roman system. Germanic tribes, including the Franks, began to move across the Rhine. These movements weren't sudden invasions, but gradual seepings, slow and steady. In 476 CE, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Roman Gaul transitioned into something new, a land no longer Roman, not yet French. In the 5th century, a young Frankish warrior named Clovis emerged from this shifting world. In 481 CE, he became king of the Salian Franks and began uniting the scattered tribes under his banner. But it was in 496, after a victorious battle, that he converted to Christianity, aligning himself with the Gallo-Roman Church. This moment, political, spiritual, symbolic, marked the beginning of what we might start to call France. Clovis established the Merovingian dynasty, named after his grandfather Merovec, and ruled from the city of Soissons. His kingdom was unstable, divided among sons after each king's death, leading to internal conflict. But the idea of a unified Frankish kingdom survived, seated in the minds of generations to come. And far to the south, the Mediterranean still shimmered with the memory of Rome. In the twilight of the Merovingian dynasty, royal power became more ceremonial than real. While kings still wore crowns, it was the mayors of the palace, powerful court officials, who truly governed the Frankish realms. Among them, one family began to rise above the rest, shaping the future of Western Europe: the Carolingians. Charles Martel, known as the Hammer, was one of these mayors. In 732, near the town of Tours, he led Frankish forces against an invading army of Umayyad Muslims from Al-Andalus, halting their northward advance into Europe. Though the battle was small in scale, its symbolic weight was immense. It gave Charles legendary status and paved the way for his descendants to claim the throne. His son, Pepin the Short, sought legitimacy from the church. In 751, with the blessing of Pope Zachary, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and crowned himself. a new dynasty was born. The alliance between the Franks and the Roman Church was now sealed in ritual and politics, a fusion of sacred and temporal power that would define medieval Europe. But it was Pepin's son, Charlemagne, who would carve his name most deeply into history. Crowned in 768, Charlemagne spent much of his reign in motion, conquering the Lombards in Italy, subduing the Saxons in Germany, and expanding his realm until it stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. His reign marked a rebirth of empire in the West. On Christmas Day in the year 800, in the grand halls of St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans, reviving a title not used in the West for centuries. This moment symbolized more than personal glory. It suggested that Western Europe, fractured since Rome's fall, had found a new center. Charlemagne's empire, later called the Carolingian Empire, promoted learning, literacy, and centralized rule. The emperor gathered scholars at his court in Aachen, encouraged the copying of ancient texts, and reformed the script used in writing, leading to the creation of Carolingian minuscule, the basis for modern lowercase letters. But empires, like waves, rise and recede. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his empire passed to his son Louis the Pious, and then to his grandsons, who quarreled and split the land in 843 through the Treaty of Verdun. This division created three realms: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia, the foundations of modern France and Germany. West Francia, the western portion, became the core of what would eventually become France. But for now, it was fragile, battered by internal disputes and external threats. Viking raiders descended from the north, navigating rivers to strike deep inland. They burned towns, looted monasteries, and left behind scars, both physical and cultural. In response, local lords began to fortify their lands, raising castles and building armies. As central power weakened, feudalism grew. Land became the currency of loyalty, and vassals pledged service to lords in exchange for protection. France, or what would one day bear that name, was a land of fractured rule, layered with oaths, borders, and ambition. The king still reigned, but real power flowed through the hands of dukes and counts who carved out their own domains. And among them, in a northern territory granted to Viking settlers, a new name began to echo: Normandy. In the early 10th century, as chaos spread across the fragmented realm of West Francia, one group of former enemies became unexpected allies. The Vikings, once feared invaders, were offered land in exchange for loyalty. In 911, under the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, King Charles the Simple granted the Viking leader Rollo a stretch of land along the Seine River. In return, Rollo converted to Christianity and swore fealty to the Frankish crown. This land would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The Normans adapted quickly. Within a generation, they had embraced Frankish customs, language, and feudal structures. Their duchy grew powerful and disciplined. Castles dotted the countryside. Trade flowed through coastal ports. And from this rugged land would rise one of the most transformative figures in medieval Europe, William, Duke of Normandy. In 1066, William, known to history as William the Conqueror, claimed that he had a right to the English throne after the death of Edward the Confessor. When that claim was denied, he gathered an army, crossed the English Channel, and defeated Harold Godwin's son at the Battle of Hastings. William became King of England, but he remained Duke of Normandy. This dual identity forged a tangled web of allegiances and rivalries between England and France that would stretch across centuries. Back in France, royal power remained precarious. The Capetian dynasty, founded in 987, when Hugh Capet was elected king, held a crown that was more symbolic than sovereign. The Capetians controlled little beyond the Ile de France, the region around Paris. Most of the kingdom was in the hands of powerful lords, the Dukes of Aquitaine, the Counts of Anjou, the Normans, each ruling like many monarchs within their domains. And yet, through patient diplomacy and strategic marriages, the Capetian kings began to weave their influence outward. They forged alliances with the church, granted charters to towns, and established a tradition of father-to-son succession that brought stability to the throne. While their power was limited at first, their legitimacy slowly deepened. Meanwhile, the southern lands of France, especially Languedoc and Provence, developed along distinct cultural lines. These regions spoke Occitan, practiced unique legal customs, and fostered a rich tradition of poetry and learning. Troubadours sang of courtly love, and merchants grew wealthy in the bustling cities. But this diversity would eventually collide with royal ambition and religious orthodoxy. In the early 13th century, heresy took root in the south. The Cathars, a Christian sect deemed heretical by the Catholic Church, rejected the materialism of Rome and advocated a dualistic belief system that saw the physical world as corrupt. Their influence spread rapidly. In response, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, a brutal campaign that brought fire and sword to southern France. Under the banner of faith, northern nobles descended upon the south. Towns were burned, populations massacred, and the Cathar movement was systematically destroyed. The crusade not only crushed religious dissent, it also expanded royal power. Lands seized from southern lords were handed over to loyal vassals, or absorbed into the crown's growing domain. By the mid-13th century, under the rule of Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, France had begun to take clearer shape. Louis reformed the legal system, strengthened royal justice, and became a symbol of ideal Christian kingship. He built Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, led crusades to the Holy Land, and governed with a mix of piety and discipline. Yet beyond the glitter of kingship, Europe was changing. Trade was expanding. Cities were swelling. And tensions, both internal and external, continued to simmer just beneath the surface. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the Kingdom of France appeared strong and sophisticated. Under Louis IX and his successors, royal institutions had matured. Laws were codified, taxation became more organized, and Paris flourished as a political, intellectual, and spiritual capital. Gothic cathedrals stretched skyward, their spires symbols of heavenly ambition, and the University of Paris attracted thinkers from across Europe. But beneath this seeming order, fragile threads were beginning to fray. The Capetian line continued with Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, who ruled from 1285 to 1314. Tall, austere, and shrewd, Philip challenged both the papacy and powerful financial orders. He expelled the Jews from France in 1306 and, in 1307, arrested the Knights Templar, seizing their vast wealth and charging them with heresy. Many were tortured, imprisoned, and executed. It was a bold and ruthless consolidation of royal power. Philip also demanded taxes from the clergy, sparking a bitter conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. This struggle culminated in the relocation of the papacy to Avignon in 1309, beginning what became known as the Avignon Papacy. For nearly 70 years, the Pope would no longer reside in Rome, but on French soil, a sign of France's growing influence, but also a source of long-term instability within the Church. Philip had 3 sons, each of whom became king, yet none produced a surviving male heir. When Charles IV died in 1328, the direct Capetian line ended, and with it, centuries of dynastic continuity. The crown passed to a cousin, Philip VI of Valois, but not without dispute. Across the Channel, the English King Edward III, grandson of Philip IV through his mother, claimed the French throne as well. The French rejected his claim, citing a law that prohibited inheritance through the female line. What began as a question of succession would ignite one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in European history, the Hundred Years' War. Though it officially began in 1337, this war would stretch in phases for more than a century, punctuated by truces, treaties, and renewed fighting. It was not a single continuous war, but rather a series of overlapping campaigns, alliances, and betrayals, each reshaping the political landscape of France. The early years were disastrous for the French. In 1346, Edward III invaded and won a decisive victory at the Battle of Crécy. His longbowmen devastated French knights, ushering in a new age of warfare. In 1356, his son, the Black Prince, captured King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers, plunging the country into crisis. Paris rioted. Nobles squabbled. Peasants, exhausted and starving, revolted in what became known as the Jacquerie in 1358. Though the uprising was crushed, it revealed deep fractures in the kingdom's social order. And then came the plague. In 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe. It reached France in waves, decimating cities and villages alike. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population perished. Fields went untended. Markets fell silent. Even the bells of churches rang with fewer hands to pull their ropes. France, wounded by war and plague, staggered into the 15th century. Yet, from the ashes of defeat and despair, new voices would rise. Some clad in armor, others in prayer, to steer the kingdom toward renewal. By the early 15th century, France was a kingdom on the verge of collapse. The 100 Years' War had torn through its fields and cities for generations. The English controlled vast territories in the north, including Normandy and parts of Aquitaine. Paris was no longer a safe center of power. The French monarchy had splintered, both politically and symbolically. The king at that time, Charles VI, suffered from intermittent madness. In his lucid moments, he ruled with grace, but his long periods of illness left a power vacuum. Rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought one another, weakening the French cause. In 1415, the English king Henry V invaded and won a shocking victory at the Battle of Agincourt. French knights, heavily armored and charging across muddy terrain, fell in waves before English longbows. It was a devastating blow to both the army and national pride. Soon after, a treaty was signed in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes. Disinheriting Charles VI's son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognizing Henry V of England as the heir to the French throne. It was a moment of political humiliation. When both Henry V and Charles VI died within months of each other in 1422, the infant Henry VI of England was declared king of both England and France. But the tide was not yet settled. In the southern city of Bourges, the Dauphin still claimed to be the rightful king. His court was scattered, underfunded, and lacking in morale. Then, in the year 1429, from a small village in the northeast, a teenage peasant girl arrived to change everything. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She claimed to hear divine voices instructing her to drive out the English and crown the Dauphin at Reims. Despite her humble origins, she was granted an audience with the court. She spoke with conviction, radiated unshakable purpose, and somehow inspired exhausted men to rise again. Against all odds, she was given armor and command of troops. At Orleans, a city under siege for months, she led a daring assault that lifted the English blockade. It was a symbolic and strategic victory. Momentum shifted. Cities that had wavered now saw a sign of divine favor. Joan became a figure of national renewal, both warrior and mystic. She marched with the army to Reims, where Charles VII was finally crowned king in July 1429, fulfilling the very prophecy Joan had proclaimed. The coronation didn't end the war, but it marked a shift in spirit. France, long battered, now had a symbol, a reason to believe again. But Joan's rise was brief. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, she was handed over to the English. Put on trial for heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, she was convicted in a courtroom more concerned with politics than justice. In 1431, at the age of 19, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. Her death was brutal, public, and calculated to erase her memory. It failed. Joan of Arc became a legend. Decades later, her trial was annulled, and centuries after that, she was canonized as a saint. Her presence lingered not just in myth, but in the identity of France itself. The war dragged on, but slowly, the French began reclaiming territory. Under Charles VI's leadership, supported by more organized taxation and professional soldiers, the monarchy grew stronger. In 1453, with the recapture of Bordeaux, the 100 Years' War finally came to an end. France emerged weary but intact, and the long age of medieval warfare was drawing to a close. The year was 1453, and for the first time in over a century, France was no longer at war with England. The 100 Years' War had ended, and though parts of the kingdom were in ruins, the monarchy had survived. King Charles VII now stood as a symbol of restoration. But rebuilding was more than just reconstructing walls. It required rebuilding authority, confidence, and culture. Charles VII began reforms that would modernize the French state. He established a standing army, reducing reliance on feudal levies. He restructured taxation, giving the crown greater financial independence. And he continued to centralize power, slowly pulling control away from powerful nobles. When he died in 1461, his son Louis XI took the throne, a man who would earn the nickname, the Spider King, for his web of political intrigue. Louis XI was shrewd, cautious, and often ruthless. He preferred diplomacy over open war, but never hesitated to crush rebellion when needed. His reign saw the consolidation of more territories into the royal domain, particularly through inheritance and strategic marriages. He outmaneuvered Charles the Bold, the ambitious Duke of Burgundy, and after Charles's death in 1477, much of Burgundy's land fell under French control. These territorial gains expanded the king's influence and helped lay the groundwork for the modern French state. But power never moved in one direction alone. The nobility remained restless, the church still powerful, and provincial identities deeply rooted. The kingdom was vast and varied, from the salt marshes of Brittany to the wine valleys of the Loire, from the mountain passes of Savoy to the bustling port of Marseille. As the 15th century faded, new winds began to blow from Italy, winds of art, science, and classical rediscovery. The Renaissance had begun. France, connected by trade and diplomacy to the Italian city-states, soon felt its influence. French kings developed a fascination with Italian architecture, sculpture, and learning. In 1494, King Charles VIII launched an invasion of Italy, beginning what would become the Italian Wars, a long, complex series of campaigns involving France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states. Charles VIII's invasion was militarily brief, but culturally transformative. Though the French were eventually driven out, they returned with something more valuable than territory: ideas. They brought home classical texts, artistic techniques, and architectural styles that would reshape the cultural landscape of France. Under Louis XII and later Francis I, the Renaissance flourished. Francis I, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, became the great patron of the French Renaissance. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to live at his court, and the aging master brought with him paintings, notebooks, and a head filled with visions. Legend holds that Leonardo died in France, in the arms of the king himself. Francis funded the construction of elegant chateaux in the Loire Valley, reformed the French language and established the Collège de France, a center for humanist learning. He believed that culture could elevate a nation, that a king could be both a warrior and a scholar. Yet even as art blossomed, war never disappeared for long. France remained entangled in Italian conflicts, and tensions with the Habsburg Empire grew steadily. The rivalry between Francis I and Emperor Charles V would span decades, fought not only with swords, but through marriages, treaties, and shifting alliances. Meanwhile, a deeper transformation stirred below the surface, a spiritual unease that would soon erupt into flames. As the 16th century advanced, France found itself at the edge of a spiritual earthquake. The Renaissance had opened new ways of thinking, but it also loosened old certainties. While kings adorned their courts with paintings and manuscripts, in the churches and cities below, doubt began to spread. The unity of the Catholic faith, once the firm foundation of medieval Europe, was starting to fracture. In 1517, across the border in Germany, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. His call for reform, questioning indulgences and the authority of the Pope, set off a chain reaction that would ripple across Europe. In France, the ideas of the Reformation found fertile ground among intellectuals, students, merchants, and nobility. The printing press, newly widespread, allowed pamphlets and translated Bibles to circulate rapidly. By the 1530s, Protestantism had taken root in France, particularly Calvinism, a branch of reformist Christianity shaped by the French-born theologian John Calvin. His doctrines emphasized predestination, discipline, and a stark rejection of Catholic rituals. His followers in France came to be known as Huguenots. At first, the crown responded with caution. King Francis I had a complex relationship with reform, at times protecting humanist thinkers, at others authorizing brutal crackdowns. After a scandal known as the Affair of the Placards in 1534, where anti-Catholic posters appeared even on the king's door, tolerance gave way to repression. Protestants were hunted, arrested, burned. His successor, Henry II, intensified the persecution. But in a bitter twist of fate, Henry died in 1559 from a freak jousting accident, and the throne passed to a series of weak, sickly sons, all minors, leaving real power in the hands of their mother, Catherine de' Medici. A shrewd and pragmatic queen mother, Catherine tried to hold the realm together through balance and negotiation, but the fractures ran too deep. The nobility was now split. Some remained Catholic, others had converted to Protestantism. Religious divisions became political ones. Local feuds merged with questions of faith. And by 1562, open warfare erupted between Catholics and Huguenots, marking the beginning of the French Wars of Religion. What followed was nearly 4 decades of intermittent civil war, marked not by grand battles, but by sieges, assassinations, and massacres. The countryside burned. Towns changed hands again and again. Atrocities were committed on both sides. One of the darkest chapters came in 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Under the guise of peace, thousands of Huguenots had gathered in Paris for the wedding of their leader, Henry of Navarre, to the king's sister. Days later, in a chilling wave of coordinated violence, Catholic mobs swept through the streets, slaughtering Protestants in their homes, in churches, even in the river. The killing spread beyond Paris, reaching cities like Lyon and Toulouse. The massacre shocked all of Europe. And yet, the war dragged on. Over time, a strange pattern emerged. Peace edicts were declared, only to be broken within years. Power shifted from one faction to another. The Valois dynasty crumbled with the death of Henry III, and into the void stepped the Protestant Henry of Navarre, heir to the throne, but unacceptable to Catholic hardliners. Faced with resistance and civil war, Henry famously converted to Catholicism, reportedly saying, Paris is well worth a mass. In 1594, he was crowned King Henry IV of France. His rule marked the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty, and with it, a fragile return to stability. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, a remarkable document for its time, granting limited religious tolerance to the Huguenots. It didn't end all conflict, but it gave a wearied kingdom something it hadn't felt in years, a measure of peace. Henry IV's ascent to the throne in 1589 marked more than just the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty. It signaled a shift toward unity after decades of chaos. Wounded by religious wars, exhausted by famine and division, France desperately needed peace. And Henry, though once a Protestant rebel, now offered a vision of national healing. He ruled with uncommon pragmatism. Though born into conflict, Henry governed like a builder. He reduced noble privileges, reformed taxation, restored infrastructure, and encouraged agriculture. "A chicken in every pot," he famously said, a simple promise that captured his desire to ease the burden on everyday people. The Edict of Nantes in 1598 granted religious freedoms to Protestants, allowing them to worship publicly in certain towns, hold political office, and maintain fortified cities. It was a bold compromise in an age of absolutism. Though tensions remained, it brought an end to the wars of religion and gave the country space to breathe. Henry IV also began an ambitious program of reconstruction. Roads, bridges, and towns were repaired. Trade resumed. Paris, once scarred by civil strife, returned to life. He built the Pont Neuf, New Bridge, which ironically became one of the oldest still-standing bridges in the capital. He commissioned the Place de Vaux and supported cultural life. France, under his reign, stepped into a new century with growing confidence. But peace is always fragile. In 1610, while traveling through the narrow streets of Paris, Henry was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic. His death shocked the nation. His young son, Louis XIII, inherited the throne at just 9 years old. The country once again faced uncertainty, but this time, a different kind of leader stepped forward. That leader was Cardinal Richelieu. As Louis XIII matured, Richelieu became his chief minister and effectively ruled in his name. Brilliant, calculating, and fiercely devoted to strengthening the monarchy, Richelieu believed in the absolute authority of the crown. He cracked down on rebellious nobles, dismantled the political rights granted to Huguenots, though not their religious rights, and suppressed local parliaments that resisted royal edicts. Richelieu's policies laid the foundations of modern centralized government. He established intendants, royal officials sent to provinces to enforce law and collect taxes. He built a spy network, silenced opposition, and ensured that no noble grew powerful enough to challenge the king. His motto was clear: the interests of the state came first. Under Richelieu, France also entered the 30 Years' War, not as a champion of Catholicism, but to weaken the Habsburgs, their main rivals in Europe. It was a cold, strategic move, showing how national interest had begun to eclipse religious loyalty. When Richelieu died in 1642, and Louis XIII a year later, power passed to a child king, Louis XIV, and a new regent, Cardinal Mazarin. Like Richelieu, Mazarin ruled as both priest and statesman, keeping the monarchy intact while the boy king grew. But unrest simmered once again. From 1648 to 1653, civil war returned, not over religion this time, but over royal authority. Known as the Fronde, this series of rebellions by nobles and parliaments was rooted in resistance to centralization and increased taxation. The young Louis XIV, then only a child, was forced to flee Paris. He would never forget the humiliation. The Fronde failed, but it left a mark on the king's memory, a deep mistrust of nobles, of chaos, and of divided power. And when Louis finally took the reins of government into his own hands, he would transform France into something it had never been before, a kingdom ruled not just by a king, but by a son. In 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, Louis XIV made a declaration that shocked his court. He would govern alone. No chief minister. No proxy. Absolute power, held entirely in his own hands. It was not merely a political decision. It was the defining act of a king who would rule for over 7 decades and shape France like no monarch before him. Louis XIV believed in divine right, the idea that his authority came directly from God. To him, kingship was sacred, unchallengeable, and total. "L'état, c'est moi," he is said to have declared. "I am the state." Whether or not he spoke those exact words, the message was clear. The will of France and the will of the king were now one and the same. To make this vision real, Louis embarked on a strategy as theatrical as it was political. He transformed a modest hunting lodge in the village of Versailles into the grandest palace Europe had ever seen. It took decades to complete. Marble, gold, mirrors, and fountains. Every detail of the palace was designed not just for comfort or beauty, but for power. Versailles became the center of the kingdom, not just geographically but psychologically. It was a stage on which the drama of monarchy played out each day. Nobles were required to live at Versailles, drawn away from their provincial strongholds and into the orbit of the king. Their time was consumed by ceremony, the daily rituals of waking, dressing, dining, and attending court. Through etiquette and architecture, Louis turned potential rivals into elegant dependents, dazzled by splendor, chained by protocol. While the court glittered, France's administration grew more efficient. Louis appointed ministers of finance, war, and naval affairs who professionalized the bureaucracy. Roads were built, trade expanded, and French industry flourished under the guidance of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis's powerful finance minister. Colbert promoted mercantilism, strengthening exports, regulating commerce, and supporting colonial expansion. Louis also built one of the most formidable armies in Europe. Through conscription and reform, France's military became a professional force, capable of projecting power far beyond its borders. And Louis used it frequently. His reign was marked by a series of wars against Spain, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and others, designed to expand French territory and influence. Some campaigns brought glory. Others drained the treasury and sowed resentment. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, each added weight to the crown, but also to the shoulders of the people who bore its cost. Taxes rose. Famine reappeared. And despite the magnificence of Versailles, murmurs of hardship could be heard across the countryside. At home, Louis sought unity not just in politics, but in religion. Though he had inherited the Edict of Nantes from his grandfather Henry IV, granting rights to Protestants, he began to view religious tolerance as a threat to royal authority. In 1685, he revoked the edict entirely through the Edict of Fontainebleau. Protestant churches were destroyed, schools were closed, and hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled the country. France lost many skilled artisans, merchants, and thinkers. Other nations gained them. But Louis saw only a purified kingdom, one king, one law, one faith. And yet, as the king aged, the strains of war and absolutism grew heavier. Though he ruled with unmatched control, the kingdom he would pass on would be burdened by debt, demographic change, and the slow beginnings of unrest. Tremors in the earth beneath the Sun King's radiant court. As the 18th century dawned, the once vigorous Louis XIV had grown old. He had reigned since the age of 4 and governed directly for more than 5 decades. Versailles, the symbol of his power, now housed a king increasingly marked by grief and weariness. Illness took many of his heirs. His son, his grandson, and even his great-grandson. By the end of his life, the line of succession was held only by a frail child, his great-great-grandson, the future Louis XV. The wars had taken their toll. France, despite its cultural dominance, was economically strained. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, had begun as yet another attempt to place Bourbon blood on a foreign throne, this time Spain. Though Louis's grandson eventually became Philip V of Spain, it came at a high price. The war ravaged the countryside, strained alliances, and brought France to the edge of financial collapse. Peace was achieved through the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which maintained a fragile balance of power in Europe. France and Spain remained allies, but their crowns would never be united. Louis, though victorious in name, ruled a kingdom deeply in debt and stretched thin. Domestically, the king had shifted in tone. The flamboyant monarch of Versailles gave way to a more introspective ruler. After the death of his beloved mistress, Madame de Montespan, and his marriage to the deeply religious Madame de Maintenon, Louis embraced piety. The splendor of court life remained, but its atmosphere darkened, more formal, less joyful, more controlled. Yet even in his final years, Louis remained the absolute monarch. Every decision, every policy, still flowed from his hand. He maintained daily rituals, presided over councils, and tried to steer the kingdom toward a stable future. He knew the burdens he was leaving behind. In his final words to his heir, he offered a warning. "Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. I love war too much." On September 1st, 1715, after 72 years on the throne, Louis XIV died at the age of 76. His body was placed in a lead coffin, his heart removed and sent to a separate tomb, in accordance with royal tradition. France, so long molded by one man's will, now stood at a crossroads. The child who would become Louis XV was only 5 years old. A regency was established under Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, a man with different ideas about governance, religion, and court life. The palace gates of Versailles, once symbols of separation from the people, were opened. The center of power shifted back to Paris, if only temporarily. Under the regency, censorship loosened. Philosophers began to speak more freely. Scientific curiosity stirred. The seeds of the Enlightenment, already germinating, were quietly taking root in the salons and academies of France. Writers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot began to question traditional authority, religion, and hierarchy. But for now, the child king learned his lessons, watched his court, and waited. The grandeur of Louis XIV still echoed through the halls of Versailles, but the world beyond its gilded walls was beginning to change. And in that change, the shape of modern France would slowly begin to emerge. Louis XV, crowned king at the tender age of 5 after the death of Louis XIV, inherited a kingdom vast in territory but fragile in spirit. For many years, France was governed by regents and ministers, each trying to steer the ship through troubled waters. The Duke of Orleans, who acted as regent until Louis came of age, introduced more relaxed court customs, allowing Parisian society to breathe after decades of rigid control. The young king was educated in the classical tradition, yet he was more interested in hunting and pleasure than in serious governance. His reign, which would stretch for nearly 60 years, was marked by moments of brilliance, but also by missteps, scandals, and slow decline. During his rule, France saw the flourishing of the Enlightenment, a cultural movement emphasizing reason, science, and individual liberty. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot challenged old dogmas and promoted new ideas about government, religion, and society. Salons filled with debate, books were printed in greater numbers, and the seeds of revolution quietly took root. At the same time, the monarchy struggled to maintain its authority. Louis XV's reign saw costly wars, including the disastrous 7 Years' War, which resulted in the loss of French territories in North America and India to the British. The financial strain of these conflicts burdened the treasury and deepened popular dissatisfaction. Court life, once magnificent under Louis XIV, became known for intrigue and decadence. The king's many mistresses, most famously Madame de Pompadour, wielded great influence, shaping culture and politics from behind the scenes. Meanwhile, corruption and inefficiency spread through government institutions. The common people bore the brunt of heavy taxation, while noble privileges remained largely intact. Peasants struggled with poor harvests, rising bread prices, and social inequality. Cities grew crowded and restless, and whispers of reform turned to murmurs of unrest. Despite these challenges, France remained a center of art, fashion, philosophy, and intellectual energy. The tension between tradition and change, authority and liberty, set the stage for dramatic transformation. Louis XV's legacy was complex, a kingdom rich in culture but fraught with contradictions. As his reign drew to a close in 1774, the weight of accumulated debts, social tensions, and calls for reform rested heavily on the shoulders of his successor. The story of France was moving toward a turning point, a moment when centuries of monarchy, privilege, and tradition would face their greatest test. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, he inherited a kingdom teetering on the brink. France was a land of contrasts, immense wealth and crushing poverty, dazzling culture and deep inequality, rigid tradition and restless calls for change. The king was young, earnest, and well-meaning, but unprepared for the storm gathering around him. The financial situation was dire. Years of war, including support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The government was drowning in debt. Attempts at reform were blocked by entrenched interests. The nobility resisted new taxes, the clergy defended their privileges, and the parliaments, powerful judicial bodies, opposed royal edicts. Louis XVI appointed ministers who sought to modernize the state. Finance ministers like Turgot and Necker tried to reform taxation and reduce spending. But their efforts met fierce opposition from those who feared losing power and wealth. The king's indecision only deepened the crisis. Meanwhile, ideas from the Enlightenment spread further. Writers questioned monarchy and divine right, advocating liberty, equality, and fraternity, ideals that resonated with an increasingly literate and frustrated population. Salons buzzed with debate. Pamphlets and newspapers multiplied. The common people, burdened by taxes and poor harvests, grew restless. Food shortages and rising bread prices sparked riots. In the countryside, peasants protested feudal dues and obligations. The old social order felt brittle. In 1789, facing financial collapse, Louis XVI called the Estates General, a general assembly representing the three estates of France: the clergy, nobility, and commoners. It was the first time in over a century the Estates General had been convened. But this meeting, intended to solve financial issues, quickly spiraled into a political crisis. The Third Estate, representing the common people, broke away and declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the nation. This act challenged the king's authority and the old regime itself. Locked out of their meeting hall, the deputies famously gathered on a tennis court and swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until France had a constitution. Tensions escalated. Rumors of royal troops massing around Paris fueled fear. On July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille prison became a powerful symbol of popular revolt. The event ignited revolutionary fervor, leading to the dismantling of feudal privileges, the abolition of the monarchy, and the rise of new political forces. Louis XVI's world was unraveling. The crown, once unassailable, was now caught between tradition and transformation. The story of France was entering its most dramatic and violent chapter, a revolution that would reshape not only a nation, but the entire modern world. The years following the storming of the Bastille saw France swept into a whirlwind of change and turmoil. The National Assembly moved swiftly to dismantle the ancient regime. Feudal privileges were abolished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed freedom, equality, and the sovereignty of the people. France was transforming. Yet beneath these lofty ideals, tension simmered. The king, Louis XVI, remained a symbol of the old order, and many questioned his commitment to reform. Attempts to flee the country, like the failed flight to Varennes in 1791, further eroded his standing. Radical voices gained strength, demanding more profound change. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and the French Republic was declared. The king was arrested, tried, and ultimately executed by guillotine in January 1793. His death shocked Europe and polarized the nation. France found itself at war on multiple fronts, both external, against monarchies threatened by revolution, and internal, as factions vied for control. The Reign of Terror, led by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, sought to purge enemies of the revolution but plunged the country into fear and violence. Amidst this chaos, new ideas about citizenship, rights, and governance took root, but the cost was immense. Thousands were executed, including Queen Marie Antoinette. The revolutionaries struggled to balance liberty with order, justice with vengeance. The revolution's ideals inspired people around the world, but within France, the cycle of upheaval continued. Eventually, the chaos paved the way for the rise of a military leader who would reshape France once again, Napoleon Bonaparte. Amidst the turmoil left by the revolution, a young and ambitious military officer named Napoleon Bonaparte began to rise. Born in Corsica in 1769, just months before the storming of the Bastille, Napoleon was shaped by the revolutionary ideals, but driven by personal ambition and strategic brilliance. By the late 1790s, France was exhausted from years of war and political chaos. The Directory government was weak and corrupt, unable to control the nation's unrest or military defeats. Napoleon, with his victories in Italy and Egypt, captured the public's imagination. His leadership combined boldness, discipline, and innovative tactics that often outmatched his enemies. In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'état known as the 18th Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate. Though a republican name, real power rested with Napoleon as first consul. He quickly moved to stabilize the country, reforming laws, centralizing administration, and rebuilding the economy. One of his most lasting legacies was the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive set of civil laws that replaced the patchwork of feudal regulations. It emphasized equality before the law, protection of property rights, and secular authority, ideas that spread far beyond France. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, symbolically taking authority from the Pope and asserting his supremacy. His empire expanded rapidly through military conquest, dominating much of Europe. His armies introduced revolutionary ideas, abolition of feudal privileges, legal reforms, and secular education in the lands they controlled. Yet, his ambition bred conflict. Coalitions of European powers repeatedly rose to oppose him. Battles like Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram showcased his tactical genius, but costly campaigns, especially the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, began to erode his power. By 1814, Allied forces entered Paris, and Napoleon abdicated, exiled to Elba. His brief return during the 100 Days ended at Waterloo in 1815, leading to final exile on St. Helena. where he died in 1821. Napoleon's legacy was complex, a blend of enlightened reform and authoritarian rule, military glory and devastation. His era reshaped France and Europe, leaving marks that still influence the modern world. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 marked a turning point for France. The Congress of Vienna sought to restore the old monarchies and redraw Europe's map, and the Bourbon dynasty was restored with Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returning to the throne. Yet the France he ruled was very different from the kingdom of his ancestors. Louis XVIII's reign was a delicate balancing act. He sought to reconcile royal authority with the revolutionary changes that had transformed French society. The Charter of 1814 established a constitutional monarchy, guaranteeing civil liberties and recognizing some rights from the Revolution. However, royalists and liberals clashed over the direction of the country, creating persistent tension. The period, known as the Restoration, was marked by political instability. The ultra-royalists wanted to undo all revolutionary reforms, while liberals pushed for further democratic change. Louis XVIII managed to maintain peace, but his successor, Charles X, was less flexible. His attempts to restore absolutism alienated many and culminated in the July Revolution of 1830. The uprising forced Charles X to abdicate, and a more liberal monarchy was established under Louis Philippe, the Citizen King. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, was a time of economic growth and expanding industrialization. Paris and other cities grew rapidly, factories multiplied, and railroads stretched across the country. However, social inequalities persisted. The working classes endured long hours, low wages, and poor living conditions. Political reform remained limited, suffrage was restricted, and the gap between rich and poor widened. Discontent simmered beneath the surface. In 1848, inspired by revolutions sweeping across Europe, the French people rose once more. The February Revolution ended the July Monarchy and established the Second Republic. Universal male suffrage was introduced, and hopes for a more just society soared. Yet, the new republic struggled with deep divisions between conservatives and radicals, moderates and socialists. In 1848, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon I, was elected president. His popularity stemmed from promises to restore order and national pride. By 1852, Louis Napoleon declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, founding the Second French Empire. His rule was marked by modernization, rebuilding Paris with grand boulevards and parks, expanding industry, and promoting colonial ambitions. But his ambitions would once again embroil France in costly wars, setting the stage for further upheaval in the decades to come. Napoleon III's reign, beginning in 1852, was a complex blend of authoritarian control and progressive modernization. Determined to restore France's grandeur, he focused on transforming Paris into a modern city. Under the guidance of Baron Haussmann, narrow medieval streets were replaced by wide, tree-lined boulevards, elegant parks, and grand public buildings. The new Paris became a symbol of progress and power, inspiring cities around the world. Economically, the Second Empire encouraged industrial growth and expanded the railway network, connecting distant regions and fostering commerce. France's colonial empire also grew, extending its reach into Africa and Asia, driven by the belief in civilization and national prestige. Yet, beneath this modernization, tension simmered. Political freedoms were limited, and Napoleon III maintained strict control over the press and opposition. The empire faced criticism from Republicans, socialists, and conservatives alike. In 1870, disaster struck. France declared war on Prussia, led by the ambitious Otto von Bismarck, hoping to assert dominance in Europe. The Franco-Prussian War ended in a crushing defeat for France. The emperor was captured at the Battle of Sedan, and the empire collapsed. In the power vacuum that followed, the Third Republic was proclaimed. However, the humiliating defeat and harsh peace terms imposed by Germany sparked outrage. Paris, besieged and starving, erupted in rebellion. From March to May 1871, the working-class neighborhoods of Paris seized control, establishing the Paris Commune, a radical government that sought to implement socialist reforms, workers' rights, and direct democracy. The Commune abolished conscription, promoted gender equality, and attempted to create a more just society. The French government, based in Versailles, viewed the Commune as a threat to national unity and authority. In May 1871, government troops violently crushed the uprising during what became known as La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week. Thousands of communards were killed or exiled. Though short-lived, the Paris Commune left a lasting legacy. It inspired socialist and communist movements worldwide and became a symbol of resistance against oppression. France entered the Third Republic scarred but determined. The years ahead would see struggles for democracy, social justice, and national identity, shaping the modern nation we know today. The Third Republic, established after the fall of the Second Empire, proved to be the longest-lasting French government since the Revolution. Despite its shaky beginnings, it endured through crisis, scandals, and wars, gradually stabilizing France and guiding it toward modernization. Politically, the Third Republic was marked by fierce debates between monarchists, republicans, conservatives, and radicals. The Republicans, committed to secularism and democratic principles, eventually gained the upper hand. Laws separating church and state were enacted, most notably the 1905 law that established laicite, a strict separation that defined modern French secularism. Economically, France experienced industrial growth, urbanization, and expansion of infrastructure. Railways connected cities, factories multiplied, and new technologies, like electricity and the telephone, began transforming daily life. Paris became a center of art, culture, and innovation, hosting the famous Exposition Universelle in 1889, when the Eiffel Tower was unveiled, symbolizing modernity and national pride. Yet, social tensions remained. The working class faced harsh conditions, and labor movements grew stronger, demanding better wages, hours, and rights. The Dreyfus Affair, beginning in 1894, exposed deep divisions in French society between anti-Semitism and justice, nationalism and liberalism. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer falsely accused of treason, became the center of a political and social storm that lasted for years, testing the Republic's values. Meanwhile, France expanded its colonial empire aggressively, claiming vast territories in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The ideology of mission civilicitris, the civilizing mission, justified conquest as bringing progress and enlightenment to uncivilized peoples, though it also bred resistance and conflict. As the 20th century approached, France was a nation proud of its history yet facing challenges. The memory of revolution and empire lingered, the scars of war and division remained, but a vibrant culture of philosophy, art, and science flourished. Soon, the continent would plunge into a conflict that would change everything again, the Great War. In 1914, Europe plunged into the Great War, a conflict unlike any before it. France, positioned at the heart of the Western Front, became one of the main battlegrounds for a brutal, grinding war of trenches, artillery, and mass casualties. The war's origins were complex. Entangled alliances, nationalism, militarism, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited a spark that engulfed the continent. For France, the war was both a test of endurance and a devastating tragedy. The country mobilized millions of men, many from rural villages and industrial cities alike. Battles such as the Marne-Verdun and the Somme became symbols of sacrifice and horror. Verdun alone claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in months of relentless fighting. The war's impact went far beyond the battlefield. French civilians endured food shortages, air raids, and the displacement of entire regions. The economy shifted toward war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and society itself changed under the strain. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, France emerged victorious but deeply scarred. Over 1.3 million French soldiers had died, and millions more were wounded or missing. Towns and farmlands in the northeast lay in ruins, requiring years of rebuilding. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 reshaped Europe, punishing Germany and redrawing borders. France regained Alsace-Lorraine, territories lost in the 19th century wars, and sought to ensure future security through alliances and the Maginot Line, a vast defensive fortification. Yet the post-war years were marked by social and political upheaval. Veterans struggled to reintegrate. The economy faltered during the 1920s and 1930s, and political divisions deepened. The rise of communism, fascism, and other extremist ideologies posed new threats. Culturally, France experienced a vibrant interwar period. Paris became a haven for artists, writers, and intellectuals. The Lost Generation, including Hemingway and Picasso, created groundbreaking work that challenged old norms. But the peace proved fragile. The shadow of another conflict loomed, and France, remembering the horrors of the Great War, prepared once more for the storm ahead. In 1939, once again, Europe was plunged into conflict. The Second World War brought devastation and division to France. After initial resistance, German forces swiftly invaded in 1940, leading to the fall of Paris and the establishment of the Vichy regime, a government collaborating with Nazi Germany, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Yet, resistance stirred in the shadows. Charles de Gaulle, from exile in London, called on the French people to fight on. The French resistance grew, risking everything to sabotage occupiers and rally hope. The war ravaged the land, uprooted millions, and left scars that would endure for generations. Liberation came in 1944, with Allied forces and resistance fighters reclaiming French soil. But the cost was high. France emerged from the war battered, humbled, yet determined to rebuild. The end of World War II in 1945 left France with a profound sense of relief, but also enormous challenges. The country lay in ruins after years of occupation, bombings, and fierce battles. Cities like Le Havre and Caen had been heavily damaged, and infrastructure across the nation needed rebuilding. Millions of people faced displacement, poverty, and uncertainty about the future. Politically, the liberation of France opened a new chapter. The Fourth Republic was established in 1946, replacing the provisional government led by Charles de Gaulle, who had reluctantly stepped aside. This new parliamentary system aimed to restore democracy and stability, but struggled with deep divisions and fragile coalitions. France faced pressing tasks: reconstructing its shattered economy, modernizing industry, and healing the wounds left by occupation and collaboration. The Marshall Plan, American aid to rebuild Europe, provided crucial support. Factories were rebuilt, new technologies adopted, and energy production increased. The French economy experienced what was later called the Trente Glorieuses. 30 glorious years of rapid growth, rising living standards, and expanding welfare. Yet political instability remained a persistent problem. The Fourth Republic's fragmented parliament made decisive leadership difficult. Frequent changes in government hindered long-term planning, and the memory of Vichy's betrayal heightened tensions between factions. On the international stage, France sought to reclaim its influence. It joined the United Nations and NATO, hoping to protect its security amid growing Cold War tensions. However, the era was also marked by the painful process of decolonization. Wars in Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and Algeria tested France's resolve, provoking fierce debates over national identity, imperialism, and human rights. In Algeria, a brutal and protracted war for independence erupted in 1954, polarizing French society. The conflict challenged the very foundations of the Fourth Republic and intensified calls for strong leadership. Despite the turmoil, French culture flourished. Cinema blossomed with auteurs like Jean Renoir and later the New Wave directors. Literature, philosophy, and art thrived in post-war Parisian cafes, with figures such as Sartre and Camus exploring existential questions shaped by recent history. The contradictions of post-war France. Between modernity and tradition, democracy and instability, empire and independence, set the stage for dramatic change. As the Algerian War deepened and political crises multiplied, a familiar figure reemerged to guide the nation through upheaval: Charles de Gaulle. By the late 1950s, the Fourth Republic teetered on the brink of collapse. The Algerian War of Independence, raging since 1954, had plunged France into political crisis. The government's inability to resolve the conflict or maintain order led to widespread unrest and fear of civil war. In May 1958, a coup in Algeria and the threat of military insurrection forced political leaders to turn to a man many thought had retired from public life: Charles de Gaulle. A hero of the French resistance during World War II, de Gaulle had long believed France needed a strong, stable government to face modern challenges. De Gaulle was granted emergency powers and tasked with drafting a new constitution. The result was the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, adopted later that year, which strengthened the executive branch. The president now held significant authority, unlike the weakened parliamentary system before. De Gaulle became the first president of this new republic, determined to restore France's stature both at home and abroad. His leadership was characterized by bold decisions and a vision of national grandeur. He sought to modernize the economy, promote industrial innovation, and invest in nuclear technology, making France a major player on the global stage. On the international front, de Gaulle pursued an independent foreign policy. He withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command, asserting sovereignty, and vetoed the United Kingdom's entry into the European Economic Community twice, skeptical of British alignment with the United States. De Gaulle also confronted the painful reality of decolonization. In 1962, after years of conflict and negotiation, Algeria gained independence, a deeply divisive moment in French history. The war had left scars on both sides, and France had to reconcile with the loss of its empire and the return of millions of pied noirs, French citizens from Algeria. Domestically, de Gaulle's presidency was not without controversy. His centralized power and conservative policies sparked protests, most notably the student and worker uprisings of May 1968. The country was shaken by demands for social change, freedom, and greater democracy. Though the protests subsided, they marked a turning point, revealing a society ready to question authority and tradition. De Gaulle resigned in 1969 after losing a referendum, but his influence remained. The Fifth Republic endured, providing the framework for modern French governance. His legacy was a France renewed, confident, independent, and complex. After Charles de Gaulle's resignation in 1969, France entered a new phase of its modern history. The presidency of Georges Pompidou sought to continue modernization, emphasizing industrial growth, technological advancement, and stronger ties within Europe. Pompidou promoted the development of the nuclear energy program, making France one of the world's leading producers of atomic power. aiming to reduce dependency on foreign oil. Under Pompidou and subsequent leaders, France experienced economic expansion known as the Trente Glorieuses, with rising standards of living, growth of consumer culture, and the spread of social services. However, this prosperity was not without challenges. The oil crises of the 1970s exposed vulnerabilities in the global economy, leading to inflation, unemployment, and social unrest. Politically, France grappled with new realities. The era saw the rise of new political forces. The Socialist Party, led by François Mitterrand, and the Gaullist conservative parties, each competing for influence. The political landscape became more diverse, reflecting shifting social attitudes and the concerns of a modern society. Culturally, France maintained its role as a beacon of art, literature, cinema, and philosophy. The French New Wave transformed cinema, challenging traditional storytelling and film techniques. Writers and thinkers debated existentialism, postmodernism, and the role of culture in society. At the same time, France faced social transformations. Immigration from former colonies increased, enriching French society, but also raising questions about identity, integration, and secularism. Urbanization accelerated, and issues like housing, education, and social inequality became central political topics. Internationally, France deepened its commitment to the European project. It became a founding member of the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, promoting economic integration and cooperation among European nations. The late 20th century was a time of balancing tradition and innovation, navigating the legacy of empire, and adapting to the complexities of a globalized world. The story of France was far from over, with new chapters unfolding in politics, culture, and society. As the 20th century closed, France stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. The decades following the turmoil of wars and political upheavals gave way to a modern society grappling with new challenges brought by globalization, technological advances, and shifting cultural landscapes. In the 1980s and 1990s, under leaders like François Mitterrand and Jacques Chirac, France experienced profound changes. Mitterrand, elected in 1981 as the country's first socialist president under the Fifth Republic, implemented sweeping reforms, nationalizing key industries, expanding social welfare, and promoting cultural initiatives. His presidency marked a renewal of leftist influence and a focus on social justice. However, economic realities soon demanded adaptation. The global economy's increasing interconnectedness forced France to embrace market liberalization, privatization, and fiscal discipline. These shifts brought tension between preserving France's social model and competing in a rapidly evolving world. Culturally, France remained a vibrant center of creativity. The film industry continued to innovate, music diversified, and literature explored new voices, reflecting the nation's growing multiculturalism. Paris, long a hub for artists and intellectuals, maintained its global allure. Socially, immigration reshaped the demographic fabric. Communities from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and elsewhere enriched French society, but also faced struggles with integration, discrimination, and identity politics. Debates about secularism, or laicite, grew intense, especially concerning religious expression in public life. Politically, France grappled with rising populism and debates over national identity. The National Front, a far-right party, gained electoral ground by capitalizing on fears about immigration and globalization. At the same time, mainstream parties sought to address economic stagnation, unemployment, and social cohesion. Internationally, France deepened its role within the European Union, advocating for stronger integration while asserting national sovereignty. It played key roles in NATO, and the United Nations, and engaged in global diplomacy, peacekeeping, and development efforts. Entering the new millennium, France faced new trials: terrorism, climate change, and technological disruption. The country responded with resilience, blending a rich heritage with innovation and adaptation. This period set the stage for the France of today, a nation proud of its history yet constantly evolving, negotiating its place in a complex, interconnected world. The 21st century brought France into a new era marked by rapid change and complex challenges. From the early 2000s onward, the country faced the pressures of globalization, technological innovation, and shifting social dynamics, all while striving to maintain its unique identity and values. Politically, France navigated a landscape of transformation and turbulence. The early decades saw the presidency of Jacques Chirac, marked by opposition to the Iraq War and efforts to strengthen European unity. Nicolas Sarkozy's term focused on economic reforms and tougher stances on immigration and security. François Hollande, elected in 2012, grappled with high unemployment and terrorist attacks that shook the nation. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron emerged as a centrist reformer, advocating economic liberalization and European integration, while facing protests like the Yellow Vest movement, expressing widespread frustration with inequality and governance. French society has grown increasingly diverse, with ongoing debates about immigration, secularism, laicite, and national identity. Tensions sometimes surfaced around religious expression and multiculturalism, reflecting broader global discussions. Yet France remains committed to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Terrorism deeply impacted the nation in the 2010s, with tragic attacks in Paris and Nice challenging security policies and social cohesion. The resilience of the French people shone through as communities united in mourning and defiance. Economically, France remains a major global player, balancing a strong social welfare system with the demands of a competitive market. Technological innovation, renewable energy, and green policies have become priorities as the country confronts climate change and environmental sustainability. Culturally, France continues to lead in arts, fashion, cinema, and literature, while embracing new voices and perspectives. The digital age has transformed communication and creativity, connecting France to the world in unprecedented ways. On the international stage, France plays an active role in global diplomacy, peacekeeping, and the European Union. It strives to balance national interests with global responsibilities amid shifting geopolitical dynamics. Despite challenges, France's rich history and enduring values guide its path forward. The nation constantly reinvents itself, drawing strength from its past while embracing the future. In the unfolding tapestry of 21st century France, social movements have played a critical role in shaping the nation's political landscape and cultural identity. These movements reveal the underlying tensions, aspirations, and debates that define contemporary French society. One of the most significant waves of activism emerged with the Yellow Vest protests, Gilets jaunes, which began in late 2018. Sparked initially by proposed fuel tax hikes, the movement quickly grew into a broader expression of discontent among working and middle-class citizens. Protesters demanded economic justice, fairer taxation, and more government accountability. The movement exposed deep fractures in French society between urban and rural populations, elites and ordinary citizens, and the perceived distance between political leaders and the people they serve. Simultaneously, debates around immigration, national identity, and secularism have intensified. France's policy of laicite, the strict separation of church and state, has come under scrutiny, particularly in discussions about religious symbols in public spaces. Controversies over banning face coverings, such as the burqa, highlight the delicate balance France seeks between individual freedoms and collective social cohesion. The nation has also faced challenges related to integration and social inequality. Immigrant communities, especially from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, often confront economic hardship and discrimination. This reality fuels discussions about equal opportunity, social justice, and the inclusiveness of the French Republican model. Youth activism and climate movements have gained momentum, inspired by global figures like Greta Thunberg. Demonstrations demanding urgent action on climate change and environmental protection underscore France's role in global ecological debates. These movements connect deeply with France's historical values of liberty and responsibility toward future generations. At the same time, France continues to grapple with a legacy of terrorism. The attacks in Paris, Nice, and elsewhere have challenged national security policies, civil liberties, and social trust. The response has involved both heightened security measures and efforts to promote social inclusion and dialogue. Culturally, France remains vibrant and diverse. Its cities are hubs of artistic innovation, multicultural festivals, and intellectual discourse. The tension between tradition and modernity animates debates in media, education, and politics. Through these complex dynamics, France's story continues, a nation perpetually negotiating its identity, values, and place in an interconnected world. The ongoing social movements serve as both a mirror and a catalyst, reflecting the hopes and challenges of contemporary France. Over the past decade, France's political scene has been marked by transformation, fragmentation, and new challenges that mirror broader global trends. Traditional parties face decline, while new movements reshape the electorate, reflecting the evolving concerns of French society. Emmanuel Macron's rise in 2017 signaled a shift. As the founder of La République En Marche, Macron positioned himself as a centrist reformer aiming to transcend the traditional left-right divide. His pro-European stance, economic liberalization policies, and emphasis on innovation appealed to many, especially urban voters. However, his presidency also faced fierce opposition from both the left and right, illustrating deep divisions within France. Macron's reforms targeted labor laws, taxation, and public sector efficiency, seeking to boost competitiveness in a globalized economy. Yet, the implementation sparked protests and social unrest, most notably the prolonged Yellow Vest movement, which challenged his government's approach to economic justice and representation. France's political landscape also saw the strengthening of far-right and far-left parties. The National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, capitalized on concerns about immigration, security, and national identity, drawing significant electoral support. Meanwhile, leftist coalitions called for expanded social protections and environmental policies, reflecting growing anxieties over inequality and climate change. Internationally, France remained a key player. It actively contributed to NATO operations, peacekeeping missions, and global diplomacy. Macron advocated for a stronger, more integrated European Union, while emphasizing strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should reduce dependence on other powers. France also confronted complex challenges in its former colonies, engaging in counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel region of Africa and managing migration flows. These involvements underscored France's ongoing global influence and the interconnected nature of security and development. Domestically, debates over secularism, freedom of speech, and multiculturalism persisted, especially following terrorist attacks targeting civilians. The government balanced civil liberties with security measures, navigating difficult ethical and political terrain. Technological innovation accelerated, with France investing in artificial intelligence, green energy, and digital infrastructure. The nation positioned itself to compete in a rapidly changing global economy, while preserving social protections. Culturally, France continued to export art, fashion, cinema, and philosophy worldwide, maintaining its image as a beacon of creativity and intellectualism. As France moved deeper into the 21st century, it grappled with preserving its heritage while adapting to new realities, economic, social, and geopolitical. The story of France remained one of resilience, complexity, and renewal. In recent years, France has faced a complex web of challenges that intertwine migration, environmental concerns, and rapid technological change. These issues shape the nation's social fabric, political debates, and its role on the global stage. Migration remains a central topic. France, historically a destination for immigrants from Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, has seen new waves in the 21st century due to conflicts, economic hardship, and globalization. Refugees fleeing war zones and economic migrants seeking better opportunities add to the country's cultural diversity, but also present integration challenges. The French government grapples with balancing humanitarian commitments with social cohesion. Urban areas, especially Paris and its suburbs, often experience tensions linked to unemployment, housing shortages, and feelings of exclusion among immigrant communities. These dynamics fuel political debates about identity, citizenship, and national values. Environmental issues have become a defining concern for France. As a signatory of the Paris Agreement, the country has committed to reducing carbon emissions and investing in renewable energy. France's energy mix heavily relies on nuclear power, which offers low carbon emissions but raises debates about safety and waste management. Climate change impacts are visible, from heat waves and floods to threats to agriculture and biodiversity. Public awareness and activism have grown, with young people and environmental organizations pushing for urgent policy changes. France aims to lead Europe's green transition while balancing economic growth and social equity. Technological advancement accelerates transformation across all sectors. France invests heavily in artificial intelligence, digital innovation, and green technologies. The country's tech hubs, research institutions, and startups contribute to shaping the future economy. Yet technological progress also raises concerns about privacy, job automation, and digital divides. Policymakers must navigate how to harness innovation while protecting citizens' rights and ensuring inclusive growth. These intertwined challenges test France's ability to adapt while preserving the principles that define its republic. The nation's history of resilience, debate, and renewal continues to guide its response to an uncertain future. France's rich cultural heritage continues to evolve as it embraces modernity and diversity. The nation remains a global leader in art, literature, cinema, fashion, and philosophy, while also grappling with the changing dynamics of its multicultural society. Paris, often called the City of Light, remains a cultural epicenter, attracting artists, writers, and thinkers from around the world. The French film industry, renowned for its innovation and depth, produces works that challenge social norms and explore complex human experiences. Festivals such as can showcase French and international cinema, reinforcing France's cultural influence. Literature and philosophy continue to thrive, with contemporary writers exploring themes of identity, immigration, and social justice. French intellectual traditions blend with global perspectives, fostering vibrant debates in academia and public life. Fashion remains integral to France's global image. Paris Fashion Week is a highlight of the international calendar, influencing trends and celebrating creativity. The industry balances tradition with sustainability concerns, reflecting broader societal values. Socially, France's demographic landscape is increasingly diverse. Immigration and globalization have created a multicultural society with varied traditions and religions. This diversity enriches cultural expression, but also challenges social cohesion and raises questions about integration and national identity. Education and social policies aim to promote equality and opportunity, yet disparities persist. Issues such as unemployment, especially among youth and marginalized communities, demand ongoing attention. The arts and community initiatives often serve as bridges, fostering dialogue and understanding among different groups. Music, dance, and street art contribute to vibrant urban cultures, especially in cities like Marseille and Lyon. Religious and secular identities coexist in complex ways. Debates around laicite and religious symbols in public spaces reflect ongoing efforts to balance individual freedoms with collective values. As France moves forward, its culture remains both a reflection of its history and a living, dynamic force shaping its future. In the past few years, France has faced a series of events that have tested its political institutions, social fabric, and collective resolve. These developments reflect ongoing debates about democracy, justice, and the country's future path. The presidency of Emmanuel Macron has been marked by ambitious reforms, including changes to labor laws, pension systems, and efforts to stimulate innovation and competitiveness. While these policies aim to modernize the economy, they sparked widespread protests and strikes, revealing deep-rooted frustrations over inequality and representation. The Yellow Vest movement, though starting as a protest against fuel taxes, evolved into a broader critique of economic hardship and political disconnect. The demonstrations spread across the country, sometimes turning violent, but also highlighting the challenges faced by rural and working-class populations. France also confronted security challenges. Terrorist attacks in recent years targeted civilians in public spaces, leading to increased security measures and national debates about balancing safety and civil liberties. The government's responses sparked discussions about integration, radicalization, and social inclusion. The COVID-19 pandemic added a new dimension of complexity. France implemented strict lockdowns, mobilized healthcare resources, and rolled out vaccination campaigns. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities in healthcare and economic systems, but also demonstrated resilience and solidarity. On the international stage, France continued to engage actively, from climate initiatives and European Union leadership to peacekeeping operations and diplomatic efforts. Socially, debates over immigration, secularism, and identity remain vibrant and sometimes contentious. Discussions about the role of Islam in French society, the limits of free speech, and the fight against discrimination continue to shape public discourse. As the nation looks ahead, these challenges underscore the ongoing evolution of French democracy, a system continuously tested, renewed, and redefined by its people. As we reach the end of this long journey through France's history, it becomes clear that the nation's story is one of resilience, transformation, and constant renewal. From its ancient roots along the Seine to its role as a modern global power, France has continually adapted to the tides of change while holding on to the core values that define it. France's past is filled with moments of grandeur and tragedy, from the rise and fall of kings and emperors, revolutions that reshaped societies, to wars that scarred the land and tested the spirit of its people. Each era brought new challenges and innovations, shaping the cultural, political, and social fabric of the nation. The republics that succeeded one another symbolized the French commitment to liberty, equality, and fraternity, ideals born in the crucible of revolution and carried forward through centuries. Yet, this commitment has never been simple. Tensions between tradition and progress, unity and diversity, authority and freedom have sparked debate, protest, and renewal. In the 21st century, France stands as a vibrant democracy navigating complex global realities. It faces challenges such as social inequality, migration, climate change, and technological disruption. Its citizens continue to engage passionately in public discourse, reflecting a living democracy. Looking ahead, France's future will likely be shaped by its ability to reconcile its rich heritage with the demands of a rapidly changing world. Embracing diversity, fostering innovation, and upholding democratic values will be essential as the nation charts its path forward. The story of France is far from finished. It is a living, breathing narrative, told by generations past, present, and yet to come. This history invites us to listen closely, to understand deeply, and to appreciate the enduring spirit of a country that is shaped and been shaped by the forces of history. Thank you for joining this quiet journey through the centuries, a story told softly to accompany you into restful sleep.